starting very slow, not to upset the...
Can you close this, please? Okay, you need to come closer because now we don't have a sound system, only the computer.
All right. All right, so basically I was going to give you a couple of maybe 3-4 anecdotes about my personal experiences, and then I was planning to sort of get into a discussion about these larger trends, broader social trends, and hopefully throughout our conversation we would be able to, or you would be able to sort of connect the two. So I will start with the first anecdote. Let's call it episode 1. And this goes back to the mid-1990s when I was doing my PhD in Canada. And one day, one of my professors just stopped me in the hallway and with a kind of frustrated, angry tone, he said, "Abdi, what it is that you want? What do you want?" And I was totally confused. I said, "I don't want anything." And he said, "No, what do you want from us? What more can we do?" I said, "What are you talking about? I don't need anything from anyone, including you." He said, "No, I don't mean you personally. I mean you, Palestinians, Arabs. What do you want?" And I said, "I'm Iranian, you know, and if you call my Arab friends, they will call me Majus, so we are not in the same group." And I said, I know, but you Muslims, I'm talking about you Muslims." So basically, after a lot of back and forth sort of exchanges like this, I realized that basically what he was referring to was that the Oslo peace negotiations were happening at that time. And apparently Yasser Arafat had said something or had requested something that had brought the negotiation to a halt and to a pause. And he was upset about that. And he was just trying to figure out what is going on in the mind of Yasser Arafat. And he thought, who is better than the poor graduate student in the hallway to enlighten us?
Sorry, 1 minute. Do you hear, those who are in Zoom, do you hear well?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thank you.
So that was episode 1. Episode 2 was in the morning of 9/11, September 11, 2001, when the planes hit the Twin Towers. I was in my office a couple of hours later. Of course, like everybody else was trying to comprehend what has just happened, who was behind it, what was the purpose, all those things. And one of my colleagues came to me, and a colleague that was very progressively and liberally oriented and very sort of active advocate for minority rights. She came to me and said, "Abdi, after this, we cannot support you anymore. There is nothing that they can do anymore with this kind of violence and with this kind of things that you have done." I said, "What did I do? I was just sitting in the office next to your office." So apparently in her mind, I was involved somehow. So that was the second one. The third one happened that night, that evening of 9/11. When I went home, I noticed that a couple of our neighbors, the neighbor on the right and the neighbor on the left, came to our house, and one of them gave us a note that we are going to be in a war with folks out there, but we just wanted to assure you that you're not part of them, so we respect you, you are part of us. And so this is a candle, please pray for peace and use this. And also because we are going to have a war, probably things won't go very smoothly. This is a sack of potato as well, so in case you run hungry. So that was the third episode. And the fourth one happened a few years later when I was teaching at University of Lethbridge at that time. So a colleague called me and said that I've been asked to serve as a so-called witness expert. The court system has this category that sometimes they invite an expert to sort of talk about the case in order to help the judge with the decision. So she said that there is this case about polygamy in Canada, and there are some Muslims, and not just Muslims, a couple of Christian communities as well, involved in this case. And so I want to go there and argue that polygamy should be tolerated for this particular community, Muslims, because they are doing it as a religious duty. and they're doing it, and because it is being done for religious purposes, then it falls under the freedom of religion legislation that we have. And so Muslims are doing that just for the sake of being authentic to their religion and being closer to God, and that's why this is my argument. So do you agree with me, and are you willing to sort of support me in this proposition? And I said, hey, no, this is not what my understanding of polygamy is. And so we went into a little bit of discussion about the verses from Quran that refer to this in Surah An-Nisa, and sort of trying to sort of translate that those verses for her, and argue that, well, this is mentioned as something that could be allowed. This is mentioned not necessarily as a religious duty, but as something, a very sort of social arrangement to refer or to address a particular social problem. And also, it is not encouraged. So that's the Quranic verse. In terms of the practice in the Muslim societies, a lot of people from upper classes, they do it as a sign of distinction, as a sign of their sort of class superiority. So there is nothing religious about that practice. She ignored everything that I said and went ahead and sort of gave her position, sort of the original one, the way that she had imagined. So that was the purpose. Keep these all in your mind, then we'll hopefully, in the course of discussion or my discussion of this general trend, they start sort of making a little more sense, and we will be able to situate them within some sort of conceptual framework. If not, please ask me about them and I will go over them one more time. So with that, we have to make it the presentation first.
No, it's a presentation, but you need to put it here and then you use this. No, sorry.
But if you do it this way.
Yeah, this is okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so click like this.
Okay. So I would like now to continue with my conclusions, but don't get your hopes too high. I'm not done. This is because I'm sure Dr. Hanafi can relate to this as well. When you're presenting conferences so many times you just give all your introductory remarks, set the stage for a grand finale, and you want to give an exciting conclusion. People say that your time's up. So I decided that I will do it in reverse order. I give my presentation, my conclusions first, and I will move towards my introduction. So here are my conclusions. But joking aside, I want to give you this so that if in the middle of the discussion I lost you or you couldn't figure out exactly where I'm going with what I'm saying, at least you have some sort of framework that you can judge whether my reasoning is relevant to the kind of conclusions that I'm trying to make at the end. So I'll give you this sort of overview of the situation in Canada with regard to Muslims. The first thing is that, and I will show some data on all of this data. After 9/11, the issue of Muslim has been emerging in the West as a new local national issue. What I mean by this is that up to 9/11, in Canada and perhaps in other Western countries, Muslims were still an issue that they were being that was being discussed. It was an issue of concern, and they were sensitive about this, especially after the Iranian Revolution in 1979. This issue of Islam and Muslim society was a hot topic for many of these countries. but they were mostly looking at it as something that was an international issue, something that was a foreign issue, something that has to be dealt with in the context of international relations and the relationship between different countries. It is after 9/11 that this issue of Muslims begins to become a local issue, because something that we have to deal with it as a part of our own sort of lifestyle and living arrangement, not necessarily as a part of sort of foreign policy. So that's one thing which is a very important development. The second one is that because of the 9/11, because of the magnitude and significance of 9/11, and of course, as you know, it basically triggered a shock to a lot of people in the Western world, and we're just trying to understand the Muslim world and what has happened, what's going on among them. And there was no easily available simple sort of conceptual framework available to these people. And therefore, very quickly, they went back to the Orientalist perspective that was there, and it had been documented so heavily, and it would provide a very sort of simplified version of a very complex reality. So it had some appeal to it, and a lot of people adopted that Orientalist perspective, of course, with sort of some new elements. They sort of updated that perspective with new facts. And what is a sort of defining feature in that perspective, both in the old Orientalism and the new Orientalism, is this preoccupation with Islam as a way to understand Muslims. And I will talk about that later. So because of the fact that the Orientalist scholars were so interested in textual analysis, and of course for textual analysis, they would go to the historical documents or to the Quran and holy scripts. They had developed this sort of basic assumption, maybe implicit assumption, that whatever is happening in Muslim societies and among Muslims have to be understood in terms of Islam. You have to understand Islam in order to understand Muslims. And that was that became a dominant sort of way of looking at Muslim realities after 9/11. I have argued that this needs, in order to have a more accurate and more realistic understanding of Muslim realities, there needs to be a shift of focus from Islam to Muslims. And I will talk about this a bit later, and the implications of this shift happening or not. So how things could be different depending on which approach we are taking. And if the focus is shifted towards understanding the Muslim realities as opposed to understanding Islam only, then I think, is everyone sociology major here? All. Oh, okay. So this is a safe
sociology, anthropology, and some public
social
policy
sciences.
and PSPA and psychology. So all the social science.
Okay, that's good. So that is a safe environment.
An unidentifiable discipline of Aya Shamsuddin. Yeah. So
what is that?
It's a business something.
Okay. All right. So then I'm safe here. So I'm saying that one thing that has happened, and this is a point that sometimes a lot of my very close friends get upset because of this. I think if the shift of focus happens from Islam to Muslims, then a lot of the disciplines that have been discussing the Muslim realities up to now become irrelevant, including Islamic studies, including philosophy, including theology. And there is a new place for a sociology, but not necessarily theoretical sociology and empirical sociology, that can deal with the sort of the realities of lives of and experiences of these Muslims. Now, when it comes to Canada, you hear a lot about sort of the experiences of Muslims in different Western countries. Canada has been for a long time, and before sort of the Muslim issues become an issue for Canada, has been portrayed as a place that is different from all the other Western countries, or at least from other Western immigrant receiving countries. And sometimes it's used the sort of the notion of Canadian exceptionalism to refer to this difference. And in this Canadian exceptionalism, there is more reception to immigrants. There is a more favorable environment for immigrant integration after they come to Canada, a more open and less biased system of admitting immigrants. So there are all sorts of positive things about the Muslim, about the Canadian exceptionalism. And therefore, they have automatically extended that Canadian exceptionalism with regard to Muslims as well. And again, there are some truth to that as well, that the experiences of Muslims in Canada are also different from those of Muslims that are living in other countries. So there is a Canadian exceptionalism meeting a Canadian Muslim exceptionalism, so to speak, in Canada. Now, this is again, perhaps a little bit of a controversial statement. In Canada, I mentioned that always good things are happening there for Muslims, an easier time that Muslims have there. But some of the harshest anti-Muslim acts have also happened, the most violent. You probably have heard about the attack to the mosque in the Quebec City in Canada. You have probably heard about the Muslim family that in Ontario that somebody with a truck just ran over them and attacked at the mosques in different cities. So there are, at one point, even after 9/11, a Sikh was killed in a parking lot because they thought that he was a Muslim. He has a beard and he has a turban, so what else do you need to be a Muslim? So that qualifies as Muslim. And so there, some of these very violent things have happened in Canada. And you, of course, remember the massacre of Muslims that happened in New Zealand as well. And that was a shocking thing as well. So it was shocking both for New Zealand and for Canada. And it raised the question of why then, if New Zealand, like Canada, is a more favorable environment for Muslims and Muslim immigrants and minorities, then why these very violent things are happening there as well? My answer is that perhaps because of something that could be good in nature, but if it becomes a little excessive, it becomes a social problem. And that is the political correctness in the culture. The political correctness that you hear about and you see everywhere is, of course, very dominant in Canada, partly because it is a political sort of culture combined with a cultural politeness of Canadians. So it has been sort of even exaggerated more in Canada than other places. And because of this political correctness, you do not see any kind of reflection or manifestation of how people think about others if they don't like them. And those who don't like other groups, Muslims, immigrants, Chinese, Indians, whoever, they cannot express themselves there. So they have this sort of build-up frustration that doesn't have a place to show itself. And I think that in extreme cases, this can very easily be turned into a violent act because they do not have the kind of non-violent channels through which they can express their frustration. So political correctness, although it is a good thing, but I think it could be beyond a certain limit, beyond a certain threshold. It can suppress all the disagreements that are in society. And as a result of that, it can push them into the background and push them into some sort of clandestine environment. And I think one of the reasons that we have this combination of really, really nice treatment of Muslims combined with really, really harsh and violent reaction is because of that sort of dominance of the political correctness there in Canada. And because of the fact that these are not necessarily products of some sort of abstract cultural tendencies, but they are the products of very concrete social dynamics on the ground. They are subject to change any moment based on sort of the changes that are happening on the ground. And one example of this is the situation in Quebec. When you look at the indicators of intergroup sort of solidarity or intergroup treatments and views for Canada, for Quebec versus rest of Canada, the indicators for Quebec are almost sort of 10-15% higher than the negative, higher than the rest of Canada. So there is a 10-15% difference between Canada and Quebec in terms of the negative aspects, and again, 10-15% lower in terms of the positive aspect. So there is this additional Quebec element that needs to be added to the scene in order to fully understand what is happening in Canada. And that has to do with sort of different realities that are there on the ground. And if those realities happen to be present in the rest of Canada, I think the rest of Canada will become like Quebec as well. So it's not something that is so embedded in the culture of the country that cannot change. I think that's one of the advantages of shifting the focus from sort of Islam to Muslims, because then it pushes you to deal with the realities on the ground and allow for the possibility of change. Otherwise, you won't be able to sort of explain these changes. One thing that has facilitated or may facilitate a process like this is something that have called the migration of discourse. Because of the communication or sort of huge advancement in communication that has happened today, because of the transnationalism that is happening in the world. Of course, it is very easy for a migration that has been developed in one particular context to travel to another context overnight. So in the case of Quebec, a lot of the discourses that they use with regard to Muslims and Muslims and solidarity and secularism are the ones that are borrowed from France. So because of the language similarity and because of the connections that are there, despite the sort of huge differences between Quebec and France, you see that the same discourses are used with regard to the Muslim population. And that has made, or in the case of the Quebec City mosque massacre that happened back in 2017, I believe it was, that was someone, a Canadian in Quebec province, who was influenced by Trump and sort of supporter of Trump. So these discourses that are happening in different countries now have an easier time to travel and migrate to other contexts, and all of a sudden it starts something different, something new, something that is unrelated to that new context. All right, so that's my conclusions. This is one point that we can stop and talk about all these general things, but if you have time, we can move forward to more details. And there will be a lot of stops along the way. So, all right. So I mentioned that the issue of Muslims has emerged as a new issue for Canadians, and that is to some extent true for other Western countries as well. This is happening in academia, this is happening in the media, this is happening in the community, so that's happening in the discussions that are happening in the government. So I show a little bit of sort of trends that would speak to that. This is in the academia. So the number of articles that make some references to Islam or Muslims and different countries, Canada, France, and US in this case. And you see the trends that are picking up from, so basically you'll see that for a long time there has been sort of at least in the case of Canada, it has been very quiet, and then it starts sort of picking up. And one thing interesting about this is showing the number of articles that have been sort of written on this in academic journals. of course, Canada is the lowest, and then France, and then the United States. But if you look at the population of Canada, so if we normalize these trends, then the rate will be much higher for Canada, because we are talking about 35 million population versus almost 85 million population for France and 350 population. So if you multiply this by 10 for Canada, then we will have a much higher rate. So proportionally, there is sort of this bigger interest in Canada compared to even France and the United States on issues related to Muslims. Another thing that you'll notice here is that since maybe 2018-19, there has been a decline in the interest in Muslims, both in the US and in France, but not so much in Canada. It has been sort of plateaued, but it hasn't shown a decline. But I think it will. In a few years, I guess I can sense in the academic environment that the interest of academicians is gradually shifting sort of to other topics. So that is what has happened in Canada and compared to these other countries. Something interesting that sort of reflects that increased interest in the issues of Muslims is are these two books. One of them is mine, The Muslim Question in Canada. That one was published in 2014. And one, maybe at the same time, the other one on the Muslim question happened by an American colleague, and the Muslim question in Europe was published by Europeans. So all of these different countries and different people in different contexts, sort of seems they have started sort of thinking about this issue. Now it is interesting that I won't mention which one, but when I saw my book was out, I saw another one with the exact same title. I got so excited that maybe there's something to this. Maybe we can make a big fuss about this. So I sent an email to the author of one of these other books. I said, isn't that interesting that all these books, the same title, have come out at the same time? They didn't care much. They didn't take me seriously. So all right, so this was just my excitement. All right. So that was in academia. Then in newspapers, in the press, there was a similar interest in Muslims. This is from the Globe and Mail, which is one of the major, the two main sort of nationwide newspapers in Canada. And you can find almost similar titles for UK, for France, for United States, that all of a sudden it seems that a new discovery has happened, that, well, by the way, Muslims are among us now, started doing something about it. Now, that was in academia, and then in the print media. This is in Canadian Parliament. I did a project a few years back in which sort of I looked at all the debates that have happened in Canadian Parliament. The scripts of them are available on a website, all the way from 1994 to today. And I was just trying to see how much sensitivity they have to these different topics. So this is the topic of Islam or Muslims, any mention of Islam or Muslims in the parliamentary debates in Canada. And you can see that it was pretty quiet up to 2001, with that little increase in 94, 95. I will talk about that later. And then, of course, 9/11 happened, that sort of surge in the interest, and then it slowed down. And again, towards 2014-15, it was a huge federal election in Canada, and the issue of Muslims became a central issue in that election, because at that time the conservative government was in office, and they suggested a whole bunch of things, banning, bailing for Muslim women when they're using the public services or when they are going to the citizenship ceremonies, and all this. It created a very sort of hot controversy. And actually, as a result of that, the liberals who were opposed to these measures won the election. So that meant sort of that the Canadian voters basically sided with the more liberal and a fairer treatment of Muslims. All right. So in these debates, I will come to that graph later on for other stuff. In these debates, there were three sort of themes that were emerging, and as I mentioned, one of them was that Muslims were now being considered as sort of a local issue, that they have to sort of find a way to deal with it locally. It is not just a foreign relations issue. The second thing was that Islam was treated as being the source of problem as well as solution. So whatever is wrong in the relationship with Muslims, or the relationship that Muslims have with the broader society, somehow the source of that is in Islam. And therefore, if there is going to be any solution, the solution is going to be a revised version, some sort of reinterpretation of stuff. We have to start them. Now, this might be interesting for you that after 9/11, I was invited to a couple of events, mostly organized by the United Church of Canada, which are sort of more liberally minded Protestant churches. And they wanted to make sense of what has happened. And it was interesting that when I went there, almost everybody had come to that meeting with an English translation of Quran, fully read, highlighted, with bookmarks here and there, lots of questions. And they said, well, we have lots of questions about this and we want you to answer. I said, I don't think I have read the whole Quran myself. And there are lots of words that I don't understand. I don't think that I can answer all those questions. But that was very interesting. That was a reflection of the fact that they thought that, well, if there is something wrong, then we have to find it here. And they invested time, quality time instead of trying to understand or the same thing that happened in the US, but I will talk about it. So Muslims emerging as a local issue. This is the graph that I showed before. So basically, these are the parliamentary debates that happened in Canada about Muslims that had some sort of references to Muslims. In 9/11/2001, of course, you see that sort of peak that has happened, but it was also a qualitative change in the nature of the discussions that happened before and after. This is a word cloud of the most frequently used terms, the 50 most frequently used terms in those debates. And look at the ones that they have on the left side, which is up to 9/11, and the ones that are on the right hand side, which are used after. And that is very,
sorry, what is the difference between these two?
yeah, I will. And the difference that the frequently used words in the discussion before 9/11 and the frequently used word in discussion after. Now, compare these ones. See, on the left-hand side, it is called sort of national, international, and on the right-hand side is communities. Yeah. So basically, Muslims moved from being an international issue that had to be sort of dealt with in the relationship between nations to a community inside the nation, and therefore has to be dealt with in sort of intercommunal relationship. Another difference. At that time, the focus was mostly on the former Yugoslavia conflict between Bosnians and Serbs and Croats. And so it was sort of a purely international sort of project. But in the second phase, after 9/11, it was a discussion of Arabs, not Bosnians. The third one again, before 9/11, it was peace. After 9/11, it was terrorism that was being discussed. So the countries that were involved in, and Canada was involved in that sort of international intervention in the Bosnian War, they were just trying to build a peace between different Muslim and non-Muslim communities, their Serbs and Bosnians. But in the post 9/11 era, it was sort of combating terrorism that became the main concern. Now, this is another interesting thing. You notice that nothing is highlighted for this next one on the left-hand side. So on the right-hand side, it is Islam and religion. On the left-hand side, this doesn't show up in the top 50 words. So that shows again that in that shift that happened in the environment and in discussions, all of a sudden religion became, and Islam became the main issue for discussion. And that thing that I mentioned about sort of trying to understand the situation with a reference to Islam and trying to find the solution in Islam is reflected in the fact that Islam was so central in the discussions that were happening. So that's interesting that in the pre-9/11 discussions, there is a tiny word there that you have to sort of pay close attention to find that there is a tiny word that is ethnicity. So when Bosnians and Serbians, Bosnia-Serbia conflict was being discussed, it was referred to as sort of ethnic Muslims. So Bosnians were not necessarily treated as sort of religiously Muslim Bosnians, but ethnic Muslim Bosnians. But then you see, even that was sort of a small part of the discussion, but afterward, it became sort of so central. So the second assumption that I mentioned, that Islam was at the heart of all these problems that you're discussing here, this is reflected in this quote from Christopher Hitchens. He says that there is something different about Muslims, and there is something about their relationship with their religion. There is something different about their religion. So in terms of their relationship between Muslims and their religion, Islam, they are more religious. That's one difference that makes Muslim sort of an exception to the rule compared to other communities. The second thing is that their religion also has a content that dominates their lives. And it is not like other religions that focus on this sort of a slice of life. It has a blueprint, a sort of guidelines and instructions for all aspects of life. Therefore, it has some sort of totalitarian nature. And if someone is more religious and more strongly attached to that kind of religion, then that means that person has a claim on so many different aspects of a society. And the third one is that there is no escape from Muslims are captives to their religion. They cannot fence it in, they cannot fence themselves out of it. So there's no way to sort of block that religion and put it somewhere under control. The religion is the one that is controlling. And this was such a popular, and it is still such a popular view that obscures a lot of the discussions that are happening with regard to Muslims. I mentioned about my experience after 9/11, sort of those meetings with the Christians. You probably know that Quran also became a bestseller for so long, for maybe 2-3 years after 9/11, and people were just going to the Quran to understand what happened. Yeah, it depends on the commission. All right. So here is the thing about Islam and Muslims. In that research that I did about the parliamentary debates, I did a similar one in France and a similar one in the US. So in the US Congress and also in French Assembly Nationale. And so I looked at the differences that had made to Islam and Muslims. And this time I separated to see how much they, when they are discussing Muslim issues, how much they focus on Islam, how much they focus on Muslims as a population that is out there and has features similar to other populations. This is the one for US Congress. And the dotted line that you will see are the ones in which references are made to Islam. And the darker line, solid line, are the ones in which references have been made. Something about 8,000 documents we analyzed for this. That are all the sort of congressional debates. And you'll see that the discussion, especially after 9/11, the references to Islam are much higher compared to the references to Muslims. In France, up to maybe 2006-07, there were sort of, they were going side by side with each other. Then most recently, there is sort of this jump in terms of references to Islam. And I think it was, for France, it was different because the French, the Muslim population for them was a much more real problem. For Canadians and for Americans to some extent, maybe up to 9/11, it was more of an abstract that they had to sort of have a position on, but it was not something that they had to worry about on a daily basis. But for French, it was. And that's why they couldn't sort of escape from talking about Muslims. But still, despite that, you'll see that in the recent years, they are referring more to Islam than to Muslims. In Canada, it was sort of the opposite almost, except for that last period that you see in like 2013, 14, 15. That is when I said that sort of huge federal election and the controversy surrounding that happened. And that was the time that sort of, especially in Quebec, there were all discussions about sort of the fact that Islam has a nature that doesn't allow for secularism to operate fully, and therefore there were lots of references to Islam at that time. But after that election, again, you see that the trends have reversed. All right, so that was the second assumption. The third assumption that sort of were present, of the assumptions that were present in these debates, is the one that is related to the solution. Now, when you have that impression that Islam is the source of the problems, and Muslims have this sort of strong, unusually strong attachment to Islam, of course, then you have to find the solution. And this is from Madeleine Albright's book, The Mighty and the Almighty, which is about sort of religion and foreign policy. It's interesting in the chapter that he refers to the Middle East. He says that every time that I went to the Middle East and I was discussing things with folks there, I found myself in meeting after meeting, I found myself scrolling on a notepad, learn more about this. Apparently, this was a crucial thing for making any progress. She even encouraged Bill Clinton, to do the same thing. President Clinton took time in private to study sections of the Quran and they found something in those texts that can be used to sort of establish a peace. Now, yes.
A quick one. What is the problem that you're saying that Islam is the source of? Is this all 9/11 and onwards?
This happened after 9/11, but I think this, like I said, this was a continuation of that Orientalist tradition in which the realities of the lives of Muslims can be understood only in reference to Islam. And if you remove that, it was as if all these other factors, you know, in sociological analysis, we start with three variables: gender, race, social class. It is as if when it comes to Muslims, none of these things matter. There's only one thing that matters, and that's Islam. So it becomes a sort of a totally different theoretical perspective in the analysis of Muslim realities. All right, so now this one is more interesting. I'll let you read it. George Bush apparently wrote a letter with the help from some of his advisors. So he asked them, said that, okay, now that we know that things that are happening in the Middle East and with regard to Muslims, their sources are in Islam and in the Quran. Therefore, you guys are tasked with finding which verses of the Quran are the ones that are causing trouble. Identify those, and he had apparently put those in a letter and had sent it to some of the religious leaders in the Middle East. This is mentioned by Ivan Haddad, who is an American, I think Syrian sociologist in the United States. The reason that is probably this is new to you as it was new to me, I haven't heard about this elsewhere, I think is because of the responses probably that he has got to this letter, because it didn't go anywhere. It was so out of touch with realities that it couldn't really go anywhere. But that was part of the thinking. How am I doing for time?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, yeah. Okay, so I will go very quickly over this. So now Muslims have become a local issue, and they have entered into the debates that Canadians have about, about issues related to Muslims. But interestingly, they have also entered into the debates that they have about themselves. So Muslims have become, it's more like what is happening in France, that the presence of Muslims has pushed them to rethink the notion of laicity and to think about their secularism and how do we need to redefine it, do we need to adjust it, do we need to modify it, now that we know that the Muslims are there. So it is not just the debates about Muslims, but also the debates that Canadians are having about themselves, about their social structures, about some of their policies, about some of their sort of defining features. And that is, I guess, something that you can find in other contexts as well, in other countries. So the first thing is that if it is true that Muslims are sort of or consider themselves as being a part of this ummah, and this ummah doesn't respect the national boundaries, it's something sort of a community that can go above the nation state, or it can go below the nation state. Then that means that their loyalty is to something that doesn't coincide with the nation state and with the national goal. So that means that in some cases they can go against the interests of nation state in which they are living, and how we can reconcile that. So that has been a debate that has been happening. The second one, as I mentioned in the case of France, is with regard to secularism. And the reason that Islam has become so central in this discussion is that view that Islam has this sort of multi-dimensional perspective on life, and it has instructions for every aspect of life. Therefore, it has this sort of totalitarian nature, which coincides with the territory that the state wants to control. So if you have a religion that has that kind of claim on that territory, then how can we maintain secularism in face of such a force? And the second one, which is also a very interesting new developments that I don't think that a lot of attention was paid to this, was that the reason that secularism was working in France and other places was that it was not because the ideology or the state doctrine was formulated so well that it took care of all the possible problems. It was partly because the population itself was secular. So there was no demand coming, no major demand coming from the population asking for a different arrangement. Now that Muslims are there and Muslims are showing sort of a stronger attachment to their religion, the population is becoming more religious. And when the population becomes more religious, then you cannot maintain the same kind of secularism in the way that it was before. And therefore, there are some in the US, for example, that is much more conspicuous because now the evangelical churches are asking for certain things, and you will see that the policies are responding, that are adapting. So is that state still a secular state? That is something that has to be debated and reformulated. A discussion about democracy. Again, there is this perception about Muslims that Muslims are not very tolerant. Then the question has been, if they are not tolerant of others, should they be tolerant of them? So should the tolerant tolerate the intolerant? That's an interesting question. And it is an important question as well, because maybe tomorrow I will talk more about this. In the case of Iran, for example, there are some religious circles that say that democracy is good and you're allowed to vote for people as long as you vote for us and we get to the power. After that, we don't need them. So that basically means that democracy is used as a tool. Really, there's no faithful commitment to it. Multiculturalism. Canada is one of the few countries, or maybe the only country, that has still kept its multiculturalism policy. The multiculturalism became a sort of a new policy that started again with Canada in 1970s and became sort of an official policy. In Canada, they went the farthest because they made that a part of the constitution, and they made it something that has a veto power over all the other sort of legal rulings, in a sense that nothing should be approved that is in contradiction with multiculturalism. In Quebec, they didn't like that idea too much. They came up with their own version of multiculturalism. They call it interculturalism, which is slightly different. We can talk about that later. But how it was related to Muslims, all these religious minorities were just making demands. They wanted the government to sort of accommodate them here and there. For example, there were some Muslims Muslim women basically that wanted to use a public swimming pool, and they asked that the windows should be covered at the time that they are using it, or there were some Muslim workers that were asking for a place to do the prayers. And so based on this multiculturalism policy, all of those demands had to be sort of accommodated, and what they were asking for should have been provided to them. But then the question came up that Muslims don't really want to integrate into Western societies in general, including Canada. They are still influenced by Bernard Lewis's arguments. They are still thinking about that glorious past that they had, in which they were the bosses of the world. They were sort of the largest empire in the world. And they are somehow trying to restore that kind of thing. They're working from bottom up to rebuild that and restore that empire. And if that's the case, then accommodating them basically facilitates this process. So they were debating whether this should be done or not. And the next one, which is very important, but not visibly discussed, this is something that sort of is in the background, and it is not a popular thing to discuss within the current climate. And that is about the problems that the Muslim community has with other communities, and the problem that Muslim communities have within themselves. So how are these part of that discussion? Multiculturalism so far has been about accommodating the community as a whole. So if the demands were coming from the community, the government, the public institutions had to somehow accommodate that. But there is more and more dissatisfaction with this policy because there are a lot of things that are wrong within the Muslim communities, as we know, not just Muslim communities, Muslim countries as well. And accommodating all these requests basically means that accommodating those who have the strongest voices in the Muslim community. So a lot of minorities, including women, including those homosexual, those with sexual orientation minorities, all of those would be sort of undermined in this process. So there is now a little bit of discussion about whether we should really accommodate the community without thinking about what is happening inside the community. Because up to now, the official sort of perspective was that that is none of our business, that is up to the community. But now this is becoming an issue that has to be taken into account. Human rights issues, I'm conscious of the time. So the freedom of expression that is sort of more known. One thing about Canada is that when all these things were happening about the Danish cartoons of Prophet Muhammad and the Charlie Hebdo thing, Canadians were very balanced in terms of the way they reacted. For example, a lot of newspapers and CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, decided not to republish those cartoons out of respect for the Muslim community. So, but that has created sort of some sort of tension there as well, that because of the way that things were done in other countries, whether or not we are just enabling that. Women's rights that are already discussed, and the surveillance and security. Again, there is a discussion about, of course, the implications of 9/11 and all the things that happened that for the security arrangement of Western societies in general, but in Canada as well. And therefore, Muslim and this security, new security arrangements are very intrusive when it comes to the privacy rights of people. So, and people are feeling that all of these things are happening because of the Muslims. And therefore, there is sort of that negative feelings toward Muslims that is growing out of frustration about these privacy rights intrusions. And here's my last point. There is this possibility, there is no sign of it yet. There is this possibility that if this concern about Muslims and Muslim immigrants grow, it might reflect itself in the immigration policies that Canada has. And Canada had before 1960s a policy that would only admit immigrants that are coming from Europe. So it was very explicit. Yeah. After 1960s, they changed, reformed the immigration policy, and it became sort of open to anyone who has the right qualifications. But it is possible to implicitly go back to that and sort of restrict the, in the way that Trump mentioned, sort of banning visa requests from certain countries. It is possible for the immigration policy to also go that direction, but this is something that we need more time and more data to be able to judge it. Let me just end with so you appreciate all this stuff that I didn't talk about. All right, so when I said that there is a need for sort of shifting the focus from theological to sociological, in the case of Muslims and in the case of immigrants in general, I have proposed this sort of conceptual framework, which is not really a conceptual framework. It is a conceptual organizational framework. So it's nothing theoretically, it is just a way to sort of organize things. And I think that this is one way of looking at this whole issue of the interrelations between immigrants and the mainstream society. We can break down the whole process into these 4 domains and dimensions. One is economic, one is institutional, one is social, one is media. and we can sort of analyze the things that are happening in each of these domains in order to arrive at a picture that tells us whether a group is integrated or not, or is received well, or is accepted well or not. With that kind of framework, and there's a lot of sort of simplification that is happening here, I think maybe we can use this in the sense of an ideal type, a very an ideal type, that when it comes to many European countries, not all of them, many European, mostly France, the Muslim immigrants' integration in society, it seems to be blocked in all four dimensions: institutional, economic, social, and media. When it comes to the US, it seems that it's blocked in those three dimensions, it's much more open in the economic. When it comes to Canada, it seems that there are much more open channels of integration in the institutional and the media domain, not so much in the economic and social. And in Canada, when it comes to Quebec, it seems that the situation looks much more like France. So the details of what is happening in each of these domains and in each of these countries is subject for another talk that I will not talk about, so that Dr. Hanafi can invite me for another. All right, thank you so much.
Sit here because we will stop now. Yeah, let me thank you so much, Professor Kazemipur, for your really last session of our class, Migration and Globalization, because really it's like a summary of the whole seminar, really. And especially in the last 3 slides, really, where we talk about how the issue of the integration become the most salient issue in migration studies, and also I like how nuanced you are in your looking to this issue. I mean, often we have books where either the books you criticize them, like there is a fundamental hurdle coming from Islam, religion, etc., or you have a very defensive books where you say that we need to study this issue only from the angle of the racism and etc., without taking into account what is the responsibility of the migrant. I mean, and really, it was. I mean, I do remember I gave a talk in London many years ago where I said I think the social responsibility of Muslims not to put the burqa. It's not a right. They have a right. I mean, but we need to think beyond the right spheres. I mean, and here where I think we need to connect our social science and sociology, particularly to moral philosophy, to ethics, to shift the debate into ethical issue, and not only what is legal issue, and things like that. So with this note, I would like to open the floor. Unfortunately, those who would like to, if you have a comment, questions, you need to come to sit here for the camera and also for the voice. So, would like. Yeah, please come here.
For wonderful presentation. My question is relevant, maybe slightly off topic, and that's why it's a question. Statistically, globally, Christian people, not immigrants, form around 31-32%, and I think that number has been declining. And then Muslims form around 25%, so close second, and that number has been increasing. And that has a lot of dynamics within it. Developed societies have less kids, developing societies, which are mostly like the Muslims are focused in the developing world, are having more children, all of that stuff. And then comes atheism and Hinduism, which are also on the rise. So did you ever come in the literature that you've seen, to someone looking at those figures and then thinking that, or integrating that policy might be looking also at those figures, policymakers, and then reacting based on them? Maybe far-right policymakers, maybe super conservative policymakers. Have you ever seen someone do that in the literature? Do you think that would be a nice point to look at in terms of global religious?
Not only global, but also in Canada, just the recent sort of statistics from Census 2021 came out this last month. And it was interesting that it was showing sort of the Christian population declining, and exactly as you mentioned, the Hindu and Sikh population rising, and then the Muslims were rising like this. So when they released that, we have a group of people that are working on sort of creating a new survey of Muslims. All of us got nervous that with that kind of steep increase, what kind of reactions is going to be created. So when was this survey? This was 2021 census of Canada, and it was done, it was released just last month. But the survey of Muslims that I'm talking about is something that is going to happen next year. There were two waves of a survey of Muslims, Canadian Muslims, that was in 2006 and 2016. And that was part of the sort of the rest of the slides that I had prepared. But the next one is going to happen in 2023. So it hasn't happened, they're just preparing for it. But going to your question, actually, you might have seen a video clip that says Muslims are coming. And that is exactly a demographics-based video clip, and a part of the Red Rights campaign that focuses on pretty much every country and say that this is what your population, and they use not demographic. They said sort of your culture is on decline and this Muslims are coming. So that demographic fact is not only something that people take advantage of in order to establish some sort of campaign. It is also a factual force, because when the population of a minority group increases, and this is based on mostly the studies of Blacks in the United States, they were focusing on the numbers of Black families or Black individuals in different neighborhoods, but the same dynamics exist for cities and countries as well. When the number of a minority increases, the level of comfort of the majority start to decrease. And the reason is that people start sort of feeling or seeing a whole bunch of unknown and unfamiliar faces that they don't know much about. They just feel that the scenery is changing. So that creates some sort of anxiety. So if they have a graph, it will start to decline, the level of comfort of majority. Then the number increases beyond a certain point, and I have called that the first tipping point. The first tipping point is when there is enough of the minority that people do not just see them from afar, but they have an opportunity to interact with them. And when the social interactions happen, they realize that these are not as unknown, as so fearful as they thought they were. So they can relate to them on a human level. And so the level of comfort sort of starts increasing. And then it reaches a second tipping point. And that second tipping point is normally around sort of 40–50%, then the minority population can become a majority. It can become a very sizable and visible minority. There, a sense of fear starts kicking. And then people start feeling, the majority population start feeling that they have become a minority ourselves. And so the demographic change, the increase in the population of one minority group, creates three different episodes, one sort of with declining comfort, one rising, and one. But this is just demographic. All sorts of things can be brought in to stretch that middle stage, because that is the most pleasant and the healthiest environment that we can have in terms of intergroup relations, to increase the interactions and create a different culture in terms of the sort of intergroup relations. So what you're saying about demographic is a real thing, and sometimes it is used as sort of an excuse to run a campaign. But even if that is not the case, on the ground, it can change the dynamics of the relationship between the groups, and it is a real thing. We just need to be aware of these ups and downs and the factors that can influence and can sort of exacerbate the situation, the bad situation, or improve or further improve the sort of people.
10 years ago, I have articles called criticizing Israel to say it's a democratic state and not democratic state. And later on, after spending many years in Lebanon, I wish to say the same about Lebanon. So unfortunately, more and more we see states that they risen in terms of demography. Rana, you have the floor. Rana Sukkari, Dr. Rana, do you hear us? Rana, anyone has C2 plug? No? Okay, so I need to run to my office. Rana, okay, so please continue. Anyone has it's called type C. Yeah, like yeah, go ahead, please. Please, Amr.
Or you wanna...
Yeah, sit. No, you need to sit there.
Those are questions.
I have so many questions. So
Okay.
please stop me whenever I'm getting too long. Yeah, first of all, I wanted to ask about the issue of citizenship when it comes to Muslims. So we kind of your analysis in your discussion and so on, you talk so much about Muslims and so on. How about the aspect of citizenship? How those are like also considered to be citizens? So
In Quebec, it was a little more sort of extreme. Those who are using the public services, those who are giving the public services, those who are working in the government offices, they should not wear any kind of religious symbol, even not for a job in general. So there were a lot of local issues of this nature that were originating from Quebec, and then the conservatives, Quebec were separatists, and the conservatives were sort of representing the Western Canada, and then they were sort of diagonally opposed to each other. But on that particular thing, they started embracing the Quebec type of discourses. So there were those local issues and those international issues, and they were directly related to that.
Because we run out of time, I would like to collect and then etc. By the way, there is among these Lebanese many hidden Canadians. Those who have Canadian things, I mean passport, you have Joy and you have Yasmin, that's it? Only two? Okay. So I, and half some people. So I will collect questions, Ala, please. And then you will reply and we will wrap up.
And how about the question?
Rana?
Yes.
Go ahead, Rana. Hello.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, we hear you very well.
Okay, so first we let the students ask, and then I ask if there's time.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Kazemipur, for your great insights. And I'm sorry I was not able to be there in person. I'm out of Beirut today. So, by the way, I'm also Canadian. So I have two interrelated questions. Can you please explain to us during this discussion the limits or the limitations of multiculturalism as a model that needs to be followed all over the world, and that's always praised by many people, including many of our students. So what is the limitation of multiculturalism and tolerance? Who is tolerating who? And when certain subjects or certain bodies are being tolerated, who is being left out? And I'm talking about everyday encounters. I'm not talking about during state of exception like what happened after 9/11. So this is my first question. And very related question is, so what does that inform us about citizenship rights? And maybe if you can highlight a bit about the discussion on citizenship, if it is a right or a privilege. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ala, you need to come here, please. And then Aya. Yeah.
So I have three words in mind when I was like reading the text assignments to this session. So reformism, Islamism, and humanist liberalism. So my three questions are: who are the most qualified, visible Canadian elites, okay, to represent such three concepts? And what are the theoretical, philosophical, political, religious, and moral models can it offer, especially to contemporary Canadian youth of Islamic religion, faith, and culture? And in what way did the tension between these three currents contribute to the multitude of cultural choices, talking about integration, religious pluralism, and living together, which these Canadian Muslims must face today?
Can you repeat the first three terms that you mentioned?
Reformism, Islamism, and humanist liberalism.
Okay, thank you, Ala. Aya, please come here.
Hi, thank you. That was a great talk. I'm very interested when you mentioned political correctness as your possible opinion as to why the crimes in Canada against Islam are more violent. I agree, but I want to ask, how did political correctness become so strict in Canada? It's not a legal thing. And why would people who have such negative feelings towards Muslims, for example, or Islam in general, why would they feel they must be so politically correct with them? And I'll just add to what Dr. Zakaria said about multiculturalism. Canada really prides itself with this model, and it is winning around the world and how multicultural it is. But what did they expect when they really want to be multicultural at one point, and they're gonna start getting different cultures, and now they're like reaping what they sow, basically. But yeah, that's it.
Okay, can I reformulate a question in a different way? Do you think, I mean, there is an unspoken message in your presentation. Yes, I mean, I think I highlighted this in my mind about political correctness you mentioned. Do you think that, if you like, migrant group didn't take into account the emotional turn of our late modernity? I mean, that we need to go beyond right issue to say, okay, what kind of emotion that they have, our adversary, our perpetrator, our the out group, if you like. Are you suggesting that something need to be more work on terms of introducing emotions in our study? And
Can I make that one, because I'm beginning to lose the
just Ghassan, and we will. Unfortunately, I have a talk in Germany keynote, so I need to leave at 4. I will be late 5 minutes. Yeah, Ghassan, last word, and I will remind you of the questions.
related to what you said at first about like the court case about polygamy and also about when religious symbols. So where do you think religious freedom ends and religious privilege begins in this case?
Yeah, very good question. Go ahead. I will remind you if you forgot.
So let me start with the multicultural to sort of combine the answers to some of them. The first, the multiculturalism that started in Canada, it started in 1972 with the father of Justin Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau. And at that time, they didn't think that they will be dealing with this kind of cultural groups. At that time, first of all, it was mentioned in reference to some communities from Eastern Europe, mostly sort of Ukrainian, Polish, and Trudeau used that in order to weaken the Quebec nationalism. So basically, the Quebec were always sort of discussing that we are a distinct society, and he was trying to say that you're not as distinct as you think you are. You're just one culture among the other ones, and so we use sort of this multiculturalism. So it was a good idea with bad intentions. But then they had that, and then, of course, since the 1970s, Canada started receiving the immigrants from the developing countries, from Middle East, from Asia, Africa. So that, oh, we didn't think that, now we have to accommodate these ones. So that's when it became, the context changed, and therefore it became a sort of an issue later on. The multiculturalism that has been in place, it has been mostly sort of a state ideology. I mentioned this in the book that somewhere, maybe in the book or somewhere else, that this multiculturalism has remained at the level of political doctrine. And to some extent, it has sort of trickled down to the level of political culture. But what I think is sort of should be the next phase of it, or should be the next area that this multiculturalism should be taken to, is social multiculturalism. And I have, in the book, I have mentioned that one of the big things that are missing in this whole setting in Canada is the lack of interactions between different groups. So these groups remain as abstract entities to each other, and then the multiculturalism gets applied to these abstract entities. And that has a limitation in terms of its capacity, in terms of how much problem it can solve. I have, as a Muslim Middle Eastern immigrant in Canada, I have received the worst treatment and the most racist and discriminatory treatments in Canada from my colleagues in the university, who are big proponents of multiculturalism. So for them, multiculturalism was somewhere there in the air and didn't apply to one particular individual in their department. So this disconnect is the part that is sort of pushing multiculturalism towards some sort of stalemate. And I think there needs to be some sort of social element to be added. In my book, The Muslim Question in Canada, I have sort of dedicated the last maybe 2 chapters to the kind of thing that can be done with this kind of orientation that can improve the situation. I have to do some marketing for my book anyway. So in terms of the citizenship rights, I think this is also related to what I mentioned about multiculturalism. Citizenship, again, the easiness of getting Canadian citizenship has been a factor in the attachment of Canadians to the new Canadians or the immigrants to Canada. But again, this citizenship has remained sort of as a legal concept. And of course, the sort of recognition that people get for their work and their contribution to Canada is there as citizens. But again, that social component is missing. So somehow this idea of citizenship has to be taken to sort of this level of social. And I have, in one of my papers, the title was Bringing the Social Back In. So basically, I think this social element, and this is something that I will be talking about more tomorrow as well, this social element has been ignored for so long, and the focus has been on sort of political ideologies, political theories, and those remain so distant and abstract from the day-to-day sort of operation and activities. In terms of the religious freedom and the limitations, I think that's a question about not just religion. It is also a question about any other preferences, whether it is ethnic, cultural, ideological. So when you're living in a democratic society, you have to start with certain assumptions. And those assumptions might have implications for the way that you're living your religious life, your ethnic culture, and all those other commitments that you might have. There was a case a few years back in Canada that there were some taxi drivers working from airport to airport taxi drivers that were from Somalia, and they basically refused to take any passenger that carried wine with them, and they had purchased wine in the airport. So somebody told them, you might be in the wrong business. Then if that is such a big issue for you, then you have to change your career. So we cannot assume that I will be doing everything that I want to do and still enjoy from the benefits of sort of this peaceful coexistence and this sort of democratic environment. Some changes to our assumption has to happen. I would say that perhaps the person that has done most work in this area and articulated the conflict and also some solutions is Tariq Ramadan. So in the Western Muslims, I guess this is one of the major issues that he has tackled. And it is about sort of how to make a compromise and a reconciliation of your commitment to faith and your commitment to living in a democratic environment.
If you allow me, I mean, his idea, I think, Tariq Ramadan is very important about positive integration. He say it's not only sufficient that you wait until they integrate you, but you will be active on doing this. So this is where he talk about positive integration.
Yeah. And I hope that I haven't missed out too many. The question about the three concepts. Can you say it again? The
humanistic liberalism, reformism,
and Islamism.
And Islamism.
So representatives of those in Canada, you meant? Did you mean who are the representatives of these in Canada? For human liberalism, I think perhaps people like Charles Taylor, Will Kimlicka, non-Muslim, but very influential people. For Islamism, for reformism, there were a whole bunch of groups. Tariq Fatah was, for example, someone who at one point, he was just trying to sort of suggest a moderate version of Islam and basically do the same thing that I mentioned about Tariq Ramadan, that he was trying to reconcile the life as a faithful and the life as a citizen of a democratic society. But he has fallen out of popularity with a lot of Southern Muslim communities because they think that he went a little too far. For Islamism, I don't think that I can think of any kind of known figures. There are less known figures that are sort of scattered in the community. And because of the stereotypes that is around them, then perhaps they just work more in the community rather than so trying to be very outspoken and very conflict. So I can't think of anyone at the moment that is at the same level with these other things.
Unfortunately, we run out of time. Thank you so much, Professor Kazemipur, and for you for active participation. And hopefully to see you also tomorrow at 3:30. It will be in IFI 4th floor, I think. I will send you a reminder. have a great time, and I should really run
Okay,
to my
go ahead,
talk.
go ahead. Thank you so much, everyone.
Uh,